Hello and thanks for watching this video. I'm Dario Mazzola, an Executive Scientific Coordinator of the project PROTECT, an Horizon 2020 project which investigates, as you probably know since you're here, the prospects of the right to asylum, especially in the light of the global compacts. Today, I'm delighted to talk about seizing the compacts, the clash of political and normative discourses over the global compacts on migration and refuge. My perspective is that of political theory, and I will analyze especially the normative and political aspects of the clash of discourses over the compacts. As scholars of refugee studies, probably the paradigmatic document we usually have in mind is the Geneva Convention, signed in 1951. This document is relatively precise in the definitions it offers. While the question of who is a refugee has become classic in refugee theory, at least since an homonymous article by Andrew E. Shaknov, which came out in 1985, the Convention provides a quite remarkably narrow and precise legal definition of who is a refugee. Furthermore, there is a point on which the Convention is even more precise, the description of the obligation of non-refoulement. Finally, the Convention contributed to the shaping of the relationship between its implementing agency, that is, the UNHCR, and the states, a relationship that became increasingly institutionalized in the following decades. And the Convention even contained, by the time, a geographic and chronological limitation, which was then bypassed in the following years and decades. Now, let's compare the Convention with the two global compacts we are discussing today, the one on migration and the other over refugees, especially by taking these two together. If we consider them together, first of all, we are struck by their name, their title. And this happens because the term compact is already more problematic than convention. Its usage is not standard in international legal documents, and Goldenziel, in his 2017 article, claimed that they represent, I quote, a new form of international agreement. They are not international law in themselves. However, they are negotiated by states and will be adopted by the General Assembly as something more than a mere declaration. And this is the end of the quote. The result, it is my conclusion, that the result is paradoxical and double-edged, and now we will see how. As Ferris and Donato notice in their monograph over the compacts, published in 2019, I quote again, the ambiguity around the term compact, in essence a legal sounding term, but indicating a non-binding framework, supports advocates who want to see stronger protection of migrants and refugees' rights, and also provides space for governments to distance themselves from the objectives and the spirit of the two agreements. And this is the end of the quote from Ferris and Donato. As it is evident then, the two readings of the compacts, which can be applied by advocates and the states, are divergent, as I said previously, double-edged, if not, and practically sometimes contradictory altogether. So, this is not the only indeterminacy one encounters when approaching the compacts. These are potentially quite many, as this image is supposed to convey. For instance, the Migration Compact concerns the rights of international migrants, a category including approximately 300 million people, but notoriously difficult to define. And let's say, the division of labor with relation to the Refugee Compact is made unclear by the lack of cross-referencing between the two documents. And to add to this, The Migration Compact includes a disparate set of items, which has been compared with a laundry list by Alenikov and Martin, and this analogy has also been taken up by Vincent Setai in his criticism of the compacts. Yet the main interrogative points regarding both compacts, this was addressed especially to the migration one, as I said, but the main interrogative points regarding the two documents concern their normative force. It has already been said that the two documents are not, properly speaking, international law. They also proclaim themselves as non-binding, and here we encounter another paradox. That is, the fact that the countries which criticized or even refused to subscribe to one compact are also those who emphasize their relevance the most. After all, if you reject something, perhaps forcefully, as some of these countries did, you are stressing its relevance. Otherwise, why bothering rejecting it, criticizing it, or refusing to sign it? And countries who abstained, on the other hand, or subscribed only to ignore the commitments contained in the document, might have chosen the most ergonomic, the most energy effective path toward making the compacts irrelevant, which was their objective. Espinosa et al., in an article published in 2018, list 4 different reasons why some countries, 5 countries to be more precise, might have voted against and 12 abstained. I'm speaking of the Migration Compact. The first reason is symbolic. It's an opposition to migration, most blatantly in the case of Hungary, as Espinosa and Dali explain. The second reason could be fear that the compacts might originate binding practice over time, or even law. The third reason is the reference to human rights as a barrier to sovereignty. We know that there are countries in the world contesting the whole terminology and the framework of human rights. We know it at least since the debate over so-called Asian rights in the last decades. And then, as a fourth reason, we have hostility to the compact, which is not explained by itself, but is a signal toward an external phenomenon such as the growing influence of far-right movements, and this can influence even movements which are and parties which are not far-right, of course, but who are trying to retain power and resist pressure from such parties and movements from the far right. So, while the countries rejecting the Migration Compact are only 3 Visegrad countries, Trump's US and Israel, a quick look at the 12 countries who abstained rather than rejecting suggests that this list of motivation could be non-exhaustive. It is perhaps incomplete. A further group of 24 non-voting countries makes the Migration Compact significantly more controversial than the refugee one, as this latter, the Refugee Compact, was voted against only by the US and Hungary, and there were 3 abstentions and 7 countries which did not vote. They were not present. They didn't send their delegates to the vote. So the views of the scholars over the compacts are, I would say, almost as diverse as those of the states which drafted them and voted them or against them or abstained on them. In a previous paper on the Refugee Compact and political theory, I have in fact sketched the following Cartesian coordinate system, which is meant to map a few of the critics of the compact between irrelevance and impact on the one dimension, as you see, and between regressive and progressive change on the other. So if you see the bottom to top, and it's the irrelevance dimension, and the left to right is the regressive to progressive one. Having said the preceding about academics and states, how can we map more generally the views of the conflict groups distributed around the global cleavages that we consider in PROTECT? This is, as I said in the beginning, and as it should be clear from the title, it's the main goal of my presentation and paper. With all the qualifications which are required when we apply these very broad, non-exhaustive, and highly porous and intersecting categories, we can still sketch an assessment of these four groups one by one. Let's begin with this, with the globalists, in this case represented by the United Nations, but we know it's a very diverse group. So one of the most relevant and powerful groups might be this, the globalists. Still, we see in the present international scenario that they might even happen to be seen by someone as a sort of endangered species, and the reasons for this are manifold. On the one hand, the pandemic has reversed some of the trends of globalization towards greater integration, greater collaboration, greater multilateralism. Really, this was already in crisis before the pandemic, but there are elements of the current crisis which are contributing to this regression, if we want. Therefore, the category of the globalists seems weakened. On the other hand, the pandemic has also exacerbated underlying international tensions, which were also already present, between significant prevailing blocs in world politics, so that no one can claim uncontested hegemony. So, whose globalism has become a very tricky question to answer. Until a few years ago, the globalists could have corresponded, broadly speaking, with those which were ironically called Western globalists by Hadley Bull and more recently by Dario Mazzola, who also relied on Bull's realist theory of international relations. Globalists usually rely on views based on universal human rights, and it might be expected that the globalists would give a strong interpretation of the compacts, an interpretation that claims in favor of greater coordination, in favor of the strengthening of international agencies, and for centralized checks and controls and systems of application, of enforcement of the compacts. Yet, in a world so sharply divided between the US, China, and rather runner-ups such as Russia, the enforcement of a shared international system of norms, even in the limited field of migration and refuge, is unlikely, is more difficult at least. Any country, indeed, finding itself at odds with a particular injunction, say about a more welcoming refugee politics, can leverage between these opposing geopolitical blocs, since there is no one single center. And this might be the case of Hungary, if we want to pick up the example made by Spinoza and Dali. How about the EU? Depending on the context, regionalists are probably very much constrained and limited in their possibilities also, as even the most developed and institutionalized regional actor, whom I will claim the EU represent, struggles, as we see, to elaborate a distinctive policy over migration. By the time I'm recording this presentation, the new EU proposal is still far from completion. How about the nationalists? This is the strongest group, I would say, one that coincides with the most effective and established political unit, that is, the sovereign nation state. Yet, what any particular nation state might be willing to, or even interested in deciding, is in theory and in principle an open question. States are not necessarily more adverse to migration than regions. And still, if we observe the political reality of the day, especially in the wake of COVID, the trend seems to be toward increasing and increased restrictions. How about the final group, the nativists? If Elisabeth Ivars-Flaten, who's also a colleague from the University of Bergen, as myself, but also other theorists of populism such as Cas Mudde, Nadia Urbinati, Hans-Peter Krisi, and many others, if all these theorists are right, the group of the nativists is strictly associated with populism and can gain momentum by mobilizing the discontents of globalization. Given the present dramatic economic and social crisis, this group, I would believe, is likely to retain its influence, at least for the next future. And this can happen both directly by dictating restrictive migration and refugee policies in the countries where populist parties are relatively successful, they share in power, or indirectly by conditioning other political parties and movements who are afraid that their contestation and competition, the one by populist and far-right parties, could cost in electoral terms. So, and I conclude, globalists and regionalists both would have some motivation, as I showed, to put the compacts to use, even in ways which are at odds between them. For instance, the European Union seems to intend the deal with Turkey, which is being renewed in these very days, as the application of the Global Refugee Compact, which is, of course, a reading open to criticism and debate. But on the other hand, nationalists and nativists, in the pursuit of their agenda, might not even need to seize the compact, for instance, by stressing the points about border and migration control. For them, it might be more than sufficient to let the compacts drop. And with this, I conclude. Thank you very much for your attention.
Shall I ask a question, Dario? Do you think that this is a question of short cycles, or do you think that this is a question, as was discussed in the previous panel, about certain ministries which are unrepresentative of the vast majority of their populations taking control, as in your image of the supercharged state in foreign affairs?
Thank you very much. It's definitely a deep question. Yes, it has been said that there are cycles of multilateralism, and this is probably not the most friendly time for international cooperation. But I will also say that, as you suggest, interior ministers and other elements of the state are definitely, and this is what I wanted to spotlight by referring also to the war on terror, are becoming exceedingly powerful as part of the state structure and societal structure. And this is not only seen in migration, it's also seen in other related and in other phenomena related to migration or not. So I think in order to make the compacts relevant and reflect about migration and asylum in these times, we have to take into account both. So on the one hand, the fact that a certain conception of the international order is probably outdated, and asylum can only be treated as part of its international environment. Migration and asylum are inherently international issues. And on the other hand, there is the growth, which is also a global phenomenon, but can be read in most states, the growth of this securitization paradigm, which is oftentimes taking the shape of the reinforcement of the role of interior minister in their authority over asylum decisions, for instance, but also in other ways. Does it answer your question? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions for Dario? And if not, we'll move on to the Queen Mary presentation.
Okay, so well, as you will have seen in the pre-recorded presentation, we've been working on an analysis of the global compacts and their relationship with the common European asylum system and their capacity to inform and improve the effective rights protection of refugees within the European Union. So the result of this will be a handbook, or what we're calling a handbook at the moment, that will primarily target practitioners and policymakers, and in which key provisions of the Common European Asylum System instruments will be assessed against the framework, objectives and comments in the two compacts. So the purpose of this handbook is to help with the translation of the compacts and their commitments into better protection of rights. So it's a way to make them work. And this is very much rooted in our reading of the compacts as instruments that help operationalize and contextualize existing state obligations in the migration context. So there was much discussion yesterday about the virtue of the compacts as rhetorical devices, as opposed to imposing binding obligations. And our reading of the compacts, which is very much in line with what Madeleine Garlick was saying earlier today, is one where we do not see this in binary terms. It's not a question of the compacts as a binding treaty or not. There's an agreement that the compacts commitments are not about creating new obligations, but it's about a complementarity of the compact with pre-existing legal frameworks in refugee and human rights law, and their role in improving respect for the rights of refugees and migrants. So this is where we highlight the compact's references to the refugee protection regime and human rights law obligations. And we use the facts that the compacts are embedded in these frameworks to explore the potential for operationalizing them in the migration context within the EU. So the emphasis of the Global Compact on refugees is Global Compact on Refugees is primarily on policy and operations. And we don't see this as a weakness, but as a strength, which can help pin down states in implementing their existing obligations towards refugees. And in the context of the Marrakesh Compact, and this is as Kathryn Willard raised earlier as well, we look towards its provisions for interpretation or the kind of providing the detail of pre-existing obligations in the kind of migrant specific context. So we understand the role of the Global Compact or the Marrakesh Compact as elucidating the kind of common minimum standard applicable towards migrants. And so there's this value of the compacts as a contemporary restatement of the existing obligations, which indicate that, notwithstanding limitations in practice, states should commit to fulfill their obligations towards refugees. Nicolette.
I'm now unmuted. Yes. Thank you, Kathryn. Thank you all. So Kathryn has just set out our understanding of the compacts and what they can do, how they can be used for improved rights protection. So coming from this understanding, we try to see how these instruments align with what already exists in a very specific context, the European Union. So what is the potential for the compacts to inform law, policy, and practice? And here we come to a regional legal order, which is quite specific. It has its own particularities. And we acknowledge at the start of our work, right? It's still very much a work in progress, and we're this is, let's say, where we started. Okay, we acknowledge the EU has a regional framework in place, that it is a framework which is also self-referential to an extent, but that it is mandated, it is designed to be in line with international obligations towards refugees. And in fact, in the expert forum that we held last November, we had significant discussion about the nature of the common European asylum system as a system, as a regime that already reconciles within the text of the law itself, states' powers and responsibilities with regards to border management with the fundamental rights protections which are meant to be in line with international human rights and refugee law obligations. So as such, our approach is one where we acknowledge the compacts are not entering a space where there is an absence of EU law. Instead, rather than reinventing the wheel, we explore and demonstrate how this space, this European space, can be augmented in a way that better conforms with these international norms. So we propose that the compacts are a means of ensuring that the common European asylum system is interpreted in line with these core international and EU principles. So the compact's added value in this context is the contextualization of these core themes and principles. We acknowledged how they can refine existing obligations by bringing the common European asylum system in line with primary law. And we acknowledge that, or rather we explore how the compacts, the principles on which the compact is based, so respect for the rule of law, the commitment to non-regression, the commitment and the protection to human rights, are already contained within the EU's fundamental rights architecture, primarily through the Charter. So we hope that by identifying those common European asylum system provisions, so of the instruments which Elspeth had explained in the video, and we'll give a couple of examples now, we hope that this will enable policymakers, practitioners, and academics to understand the relationship between the two regimes, and in the process, to identify the anchor in EU law that is required, that can be used by a practitioner for the in a specific case, in a specific national context. But we also hope that by identifying gaps or inconsistencies between the compacts and the common European asylum system provisions, we can highlight those areas that require further action, such as law or policy change. Kathryn?
Yeah, sorry, just unmuting. So that's sort of setting out, I suppose, our sort of theoretical methodology and the theoretical framework in a bit more detail to follow on from Elspeth's video. And conscious of time, but we wanted to pull out a few of our preliminary findings from this sort of mapping of the compacts against the common European asylum system. And in questions, we're happy to go into more detail on these or talk about some of the other instruments. So there are 5 kind of core instruments of the common European asylum system, and I'll pull out an example from the Dublin III regulation. So this is the instrument that sets out the rules for responsibility of a member state for examining an asylum application made in its territory. So it holds that applications, amongst other things, must be made in the country of entry. And if an application is not or is deemed not to have been made in the country of entry, then an individual will be sent back to that country of entry to make their application there. And this is in Article 3. And how we sort of map this against the commitments made in the Global Compact on Refugees is the commitments made there around, which set out how the international community should respond to refugee flows through burden sharing and allocation of responsibility. But in contrast to the Dublin III regulation, which promotes solidarity without concern for refugee involvement or refugee agency, the Global Compact on Refugees in particular is rooted in the importance of refugee agency. So the compact promotes the agency of the refugee, which is overlooked at all points in the Dublin system. So the principle in the Global Compact on Refugees is to transfer resources required to states in need of assistance, not to transfer people. So it calls for a greater assistance to states faced with large-scale refugee situations and for a multi-stakeholder and partnership approach. And so this is an example of how we see the Global Compact operationalizing and contextualizing member state obligations.
Yes. Now, maybe I can give an example from the Procedures Directive, right, which we are looking at. And it's quite, we all know that the convention defines who a refugee is, but doesn't tell us the procedure to be followed, etc., etc. But in what the Global Compacts, what we have is a very clear setting out of the need to avoid protection gaps. So if we look at the way in which the compacts are formulated, they are designed in such a way to ensure that no one slips through the cracks, that individuals in need of protection are identified as such in order to get the rights that they are entitled to at law, under international refugee law, under international human rights law. So being aware and conscious of that ethos, let's say, when we compare the Procedures Directive, which establishes common procedures for granting and withdrawing international protection within the EU, we see how the slicing of the procedure, let's say the creation of little procedures, whether it is in the context of border procedures, whether it is in accelerating procedures, concepts to designed to identify or exclude individuals, whether they can on the basis of safe third country concepts, we see that the thinking behind the Procedures Directive and in fact its provisions are counter. Right? They, instead of minimizing the risk of individuals slipping through the cracks, the slicing of the procedure into these different discrete additional procedures that don't focus on the substantive elements have the risk of excluding individuals. So this is something Elspeth mentioned it yesterday, a very striking case from the Committee on the Protection Against and for Disappearance. We have multiple examples in the European context of individuals who have, let's say, a prima facie claim to protection, but whose protection claim never gets examined because they are channeled into all these different procedures. So what can we do from a Global Compact perspective? Well, one of the things that we are looking into at the moment is we have, apart from the principle of non-refoulement, right, which the whole compacts are embedded in as well by virtue of their reference to international refugee law, we also have the compact, the GCM, for example, that speaks on Objective 12 on certainty and predictability in migration procedures and about reducing vulnerabilities in migration. So what we are looking into what those objectives, the commitments that states have signed up to in that context, how they can be used to make the procedure one which does not exclude the individual migrant, but the individual refugee, but is actually implemented in a way that enhances, that enables them to get the introduction, the protection that they are entitled to. I will leave it there, but we are very happy to take questions and we look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicolette. I know I rushed you a bit there at the end. We still have one more presentation to go. I haven't received any questions for this particular one in the chat, so I'm actually just going to hand the word over to our last presenters, and if we have any questions, oh, here we go. Great. I view the Global Compact in line with soft law. Do you think that it will hold as much weight as similar soft law pieces of legislation like the UNHCR? If so, how can its place be cemented? And that's an interesting question for you. And I guess that's what you're all wondering, isn't it? Who wants to take it? The three of you, raise your hand. Yep, Nicolette, you're up. Go ahead.
I'll take it, but obviously if you want. Well, I suppose this is exactly what we hope to achieve through the compacts, right? How do soft law instruments get to make an impact? And well, one of our understandings is that it is through being used in individual cases, through getting judicial recognition, through getting them to be cited in cases. And Kathryn and Elspeth also have experience with drafting a handbook in the UK context, where what has been quite interesting is looking at how other soft law instruments, the person who posed the question mentioned like UNHCR EXCOM conclusions, for example, and seeing how, tracking how those get through the courts in individual cases, that is a way in which to start augmenting that level of protection, start through an incremental process, I suppose, but also giving visibility to the instruments. And that is what we hope to achieve by operation. When we say we operationalize the compact, well, paragraph 44 says that this is addressed to a wide variety of audience, to wide multiple stakeholders. We all have an obligation in implementing the compact. We are all called upon to make this, to use this in order to result in that improved rights protection. So our handbook, we hope, will be one of the ways in which we do get soft law to work in a very specific context.
Thank you so much, Nicolette. I think we'll have to move on now because we're actually not doing too well for time, and we want obviously to hear from our next presenters on work package 7 and our mediated discourses.
So I will be presenting on media and migration, how international protection is covered in public discourse. And our research goals are to identify the presence or absence of the global political cleavage system of international protection in newspapers and news agencies. And actually, this was the topic of my video presentation, the first point, and I would refer you to that as well. And the second goal is to detect changes in the discourse based on national elections and mediatized events. And this is what I will be focusing on in this presentation today. I think the global political cleavage system of international protection is quite clear to most people here because it is the overarching theoretical framework of the project. By Hakan Sichakan. He understands political cleavages as discerning, or we can discern them by the position on the particularism universalism continuum, the view of what the natural political unit is, and the stance on role and power of political institutions at different levels. Based on this, we distinguish between 5 different discourses, the nativist, nation statist, regionalist, human rights, and market globalist discourses. And this is just that the nativists their positions are at the far end of the particularist scale. They find the natural political unit as, or they define it as the narrowest from all of these discourse categories, and they want to exclude all foreign actors opposed to international obligations and cooperation. Nation statists and regionalists are in between them, and the globalists have the other end of the spectrum. They are placed at the universalist end of the scale. They wish a global multi-level polity and an increase of power for international institutions. And we are trying to operationalize this with a dictionary approach. A dictionary approach is basically a word list that tries to detect phrases and words that can describe a concept. It's a theory-derived method, and it is, or it can be qualitatively validated and problem-specific. It has, however, the disadvantage, because we are counting frequencies of words that are occurring in a text, that it omits linguistic change and structure. Before I talk a little bit about the application of this dictionary, I just want to say a few words on the data collection. We collected data via the event registry platform with a keyword-based search query. And we collected newspaper articles from the UK and Germany in 2014 until 2019. For the UK, we have around 250,000 articles, and for Germany, around 900,000 articles in this time frame. And I'm just focusing on the UK and Germany here, but we collected data on many more countries. And just to show you an example for the nativist, or for texts containing nativists or globalist words, we can see here that the nativists, I'm not going to read it out, but the nativists are, text is about deportation of an alleged criminal asylum seeker, and the human rights globalist discourse is about the struggles of LGBT asylum seekers to gain recognition. And this just goes to show that the different understanding of the particularist universalist continuum can be discerned quite well, and that our dictionary seems to work. And like I said, I want to focus on the impact of events. So the question is there an impact of national election on the discourse categories, or of national events on the discourse categories? And for this purpose, I am using a Bayesian structural time series model to detect the effect of an intervention on a time series. In our case, the intervention is the election or the national event. And this model uses a response time series and a control time series to predict a counterfactual. In other words, it tries to predict how the time series would have evolved had the event never occurred. So this is an illustration of such a prediction applied to the UK 2015 general election on the regionalist discourse. The intervention in this case is the vertical dashed line in the picture here, and the predicted effect is the dashed line, and the observed effect is the other line. So we see that these lines do not follow the same curve. So when we look at the p-values for this example, we see that this discrepancy is significant. So this means that the difference between the observed and the counterfactual is not due to chance. This is the case for the regionalist discourse and the globalist discourses in the 2015 election for the UK, but not for the 2017 election, which just means that the national election did not have a significant impact on the discourse at all. And in the German 2017 election, or the German 2017 election only had a significant impact on the nativist discourse. When we look at some national events, I just chose 2 events for the purpose of this presentation. I chose the Brexit referendum and the impact of Merkel's "We can do this" on the discourse in Germany. And we can see that the Brexit referendum actually did not have a significant impact on the 5 discourse categories. However, in the case of the German case, or the German Merkel "We can do this," which was a response to Syrian refugees coming to Germany, we can see that the nativist discourse that is significant. So the impact was only significant on a nativist discourse. So national elections seem to have a bigger impact on the migration discourses than the tested national events. And this shows that political campaigns are not solely responsible for the dominant discourse, but may also be due to changing political leadership. And this is also different depending on the context. Here we can see, for example, or we saw that in 2015 in the UK, the impact was significant. However, in 2017, it was not. And my conjecture is that this is might be due to being at a later time point. As also national events like the Brexit referendum and Merkel "We can do this" overall did not impact the discourses heavily. However, the pro-refugee event, or I'm terming it pro-refugee event because it was perceived as that in the media in Germany with Merkel's "We can do this" led to a nativist backlash. Overall, discourses in the UK and Germany may be more heavily driven by international events or a sum of different events than just this one event that I tested. And I just want to make some suggestions for practice, because the newspapers overall are dominated by the globalist discourse, and this is also a finding from the video presentation. So I would like to refer you back to that as well. Are dominated by the globalist discourses, and so it might be that nativist and nationalist discourses are conducted elsewhere. So to address nativist and nationalist narratives, we might have to look at different mediums. In the national elections and events that I spoke about right now, they only have an impact on some discourses, which means that the discourses may mainly be driven by the overall context, not a single event. And to achieve substantive change, we would have to, or practitioners would have to address these narratives consistently to achieve change. Thank you for your attention, and I would be glad to receive any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sara, for a very interesting presentation. These findings are extremely innovative and interesting for the project overall. We're only going to allow one very short one, as we will reconvene in the main room very soon. If you want to watch the full presentations for all these panelists, they are available online. So if you want to visit our YouTube channel, there's a playlist there with the presentations. Thank you very much to our panelists for this panel. It's been wonderful to hear you and see you once again. For those of you who have the link to the main room, you can reconvene there for closing remarks. And for those of you who need the link, you can either just scroll up in the chat, or I can paste it again in the chat in 1 second. So thank you very much for this. If you're ready, you can just head out to the main room and I'll see you there. Thanks, everyone.